Out. The hospital's estimate arrived like July on official letterhead, $87,000. 12 dialysis machines, identical error codes, one catastrophic failure window. Renata Cross had not authorized the service contract renewal. Out. Instead, she made a call to the man the hospital had quietly let go 14 months earlier. The man who had filed a formal equipment safety report about this exact malfunction pattern and watched the facilities director delete it from the shared drive and hand him a termination letter the following week. That evening, Warren Dill sat alone in the small medical equipment repair shop he ran out of a converted garage on Clement Street in Spokane, Washington. A calibration kit on the bench. Out. A $9 pressure valve in a labeled parts tray. He had lost a career for knowing too much. Now the question was whether knowing it still mattered. Out. The morning Renata called had started the way most mornings did at Dill Biomedical Services. Warren had arrived at 6:50, unlocked the side entrance with the key that required lifting the handle at exactly the same angle every time, switched on the overhead fluorescence from the panel beside the door, and set the electric kettle going before anything else. Out. The shop occupied what had once been a two-car garage attached to a narrow house on a residential block that saw more dog walkers than delivery trucks. The neighbors had been skeptical in the first year. They were quieter about it now. Out. The equipment along the back wall was arranged with a precision that seemed mismatched with the setting. Every pressure gauge stored in its foam cutout, every cable on its hook rather than coiled on the floor, every calibration log filed by date in binders with handwritten tabs. Out. The testing station near the rear window was the most expensive thing in the building, acquired from a regional hospital surplus sale, and updated annually with manufacturer software packages that cost more than Warren sometimes thought they should, given the volume of work passing through. Out. He had made that investment a priority because the work required it and because he understood that the argument for a small independent shop was not price, it was accuracy. And accuracy required proper tools. Out. His son-in-law, Pete Vargas, arrived at 7. Pete was 31, trained through a hospital biomedical technician program, and 2 years into a trade he was learning at a pace that moved faster in some weeks than others. He was dependable in the way that mattered most. He didn't fill uncertainty with confidence he hadn't earned. He said when he wasn't sure. He asked before assuming. Out. In the shop's small front office separated from the work area by a wall of pegboard and a glass panel, Warren's son Ben had fallen asleep in the waiting chair with his jacket over his face and his sneakers still on. School was out for a professional development day, and the woman who sometimes stayed with Ben on short notice was visiting her sister in Portland. Warren had turned the space heater toward the chair without waking him. Pete noticed and said nothing. Out. The shape of Warren's days was not a subject either of them addressed directly. It was simply part of how the shop functioned. Out. The call came at 8:40. Out. Renata Cross introduced herself without ceremony. She was the director of procurement and operations at Cascade Valley Medical Center, a regional hospital with 2 campuses serving the eastern corridor of Spokane County. The problem, she said, had been developing for close to 3 weeks, and she was now at the point where she needed someone outside the current vendor relationship to look at it clearly. Out. 12 Fresenius hemodialysis machines, all 2022 model units, all maintained under a comprehensive service agreement with Meridian Medical Equipment Group, had been brought in for their annual calibration and preventive maintenance during the first week of November. All 12 had been returned with clean service documentation. Out. Within 18 days, all 12 had begun producing a recurring fault that interrupted treatment sessions and forced manual override procedures that added between 20 and 40 minutes to each dialysis cycle. The effect on nursing staff, on patient scheduling, and on the unit's operational capacity had been severe. Out. That morning, she had received a formal remediation estimate from Meridian, $87,000 to replace the ultrafiltration control modules across all 12 machines, $7,250 per unit, covering parts, labor, and a system recertification process she said Meridian's representative had described as, quote, non-negotiable for FDA compliance purposes. Out. She had not signed. Out. What stopped her was the same arithmetic that had stopped Margaret Holloway in a different city in a different industry the year prior, the symmetry of it. 12 machines, same fault, same timeline, same service window. In her experience, that kind of alignment did not happen by accident. Out. Warren listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked 2 things. What specific fault code was displaying, and had the machines been running continuous patient loads since they came back from service? Out. She read him the code from the incident log. F77 ultrafiltration pressure variance, consistent across all 12 units, appearing reliably between 40 and 60 minutes into each treatment session. He asked her to describe how the fault presented, whether it escalated gradually or appeared suddenly. she said suddenly, all at once, the same way each time, as though a threshold had been crossed rather than a component degrading in sequence. Out. Warren was quiet for a moment longer than she expected. Out. Then he told her he would come look at one of the machines in person. Out. He did not tell her that the silence had been recognition, that he had written a service bulletin about F-77 on this exact model line 22 months ago and watched it get filed in a folder marked reviewed and not forwarded to anyone. Out. He had spent 6 years at Meridian Medical Equipment Group, first as a field technician on dialysis and infusion platforms, then as the lead service engineer for the Pacific Northwest region, covering Fresenius, B-Braun, and Nipro machines across 14 hospital accounts. In late 2022, while investigating 2 F-77 incidents at separate facilities in the region, he had identified a documented failure pattern in the 2022 Fresenius ultrafiltration assembly. Out. The inlet pressure compensation solenoid, a component that cost $9 and was seated in a secondary manifold housing behind the machine's front service panel, would develop microfractures in its polymer seat after repeated thermal cycling. At room temperature, the solenoid seated correctly and passed all standard calibration checks. Out. Under treatment load, when the machine's internal temperature rose during active filtration cycles, the seat's dimensional tolerance would shift by less than half a millimeter, enough to produce an inconsistent seal, enough to cause the ultrafiltration pressure sensor to read variance outside its programmed window, and enough to trigger F-77 simultaneously across every connected alert in the machine's monitoring system. Out. Not a module failure, not a software fault, not an FDA compliance issue, a $9 solenoid seat with a thermal behavior that was invisible at ambient conditions and only detectable under sustained clinical load. Out. Warren had compiled the failure signature from both incidents, attached the manufacturer's field advisory that Fresenius had quietly distributed to certified service partners in October of that year, and submitted the full package to his regional director with a written recommendation to add solenoid seat inspection to the preventive maintenance checklist for every 2022 model unit in their service portfolio. Out. The regional director's name was Alan Fitch. His reply had arrived within 3 days, not within current service protocol scope. Proceed with standard PM procedures. Out. 4 months later, Warren Dill had been separated from Meridian Medical Equipment Group. His exit documentation cited performance below expectations for client retention metrics. Out. He had kept a printed copy of both emails in a manila envelope in his filing cabinet. He had not opened it in 14 months. Out. The drive to Cascade Valley's main campus took 20 minutes. Pete stayed with Ben at the shop. Warren arrived at the medical equipment room with his calibration kit and a parts tray that included, among other components, 3 solenoid seat assemblies he had picked up from a Fresenius authorized parts distributor on his way out of the shop. Out. The machine Renata's team had set aside was a Fresenius 2008 K2 2022 manufacture date, 31,000 treatment hours logged, service records current through the November maintenance visit. When Warren powered it through its startup cycle, the diagnostic screen returned clean, 0 active faults. Out. He connected his calibration logger to the service port and ran the machine through a simulated treatment protocol. Not a live patient load, but a full cycle pressure and flow simulation that brought the internal temperature up through its normal operating range. Out. At 93 degrees Fahrenheit internal cabinet temperature, the pressure variance reading was within spec. Out. At 104 degrees, it drifted 1 point above the lower threshold. Out. At 111 degrees, it hit F-77. Every alert on the panel tripped simultaneously. Out. He ran the cycle twice more. The fault presented at the same temperature window both times within 40 seconds of each other. Out. Pete called while Warren was documenting the second run. He asked how it was going. Warren told him the solenoid seat was failing under thermal load exactly the way the field advisory had described. Pete asked how long the replacement would take. Warren said 12 minutes per machine if he didn't rush. Out. He pulled the front service panel on the machine with a quarter-turn release and located the ultrafiltration manifold housing behind the pump assembly. The solenoid seat was seated in a recessed collar held by a retaining clip. He pulled it with a pick tool and held it under the room's overhead light. Visually, the seat appeared intact. No visible fracture, no discoloration, no debris in the collar. Out. The failure was dimensional. A change in the polymer's geometry that was measurable only under temperature and pressure, and invisible to any inspection conducted at room temperature with the machine inactive. Out. He installed the replacement seat, reassembled the manifold housing, and ran the simulation again. At 111 degrees internal temperature, the pressure variance reading held steady, no fault. Out. He ran it 3 more times at full temperature, clean each time. Out. He documented everything, temperature readings at each test interval, pressure variance logs before and after, photographs of the original seat beside the replacement with a ruler for scale, the fault code display and the clean display side by side, time elapsed between engine start and fault presentation in the original configuration, time elapsed at equivalent temperature in the corrected configuration, 0 faults. Out. Then he called Renata Cross and told her exactly what he had found, what he had replaced and what the part had cost. Out. There was a pause on her end. Out. She said she'd need to loop in the hospital's biomedical engineering director and their compliance officer before any further work proceeded. She said it carefully. The way people in institutional roles say things when they understand the implications are larger than the conversation they're currently in. Warren told her to take the time she needed. He sent his full documentation to her email before he left the parking lot. Out. Within an hour, a man named Dennis Volk was on her phone. Out. Volk was Meridian's account director for the Cascade Valley relationship. He had been in the role for 9 years and he knew how to handle the specific kind of call that began with a client mentioning an outside technician. Out. He told Renata that a solenoid seat replacement might suppress the F77 code in the short term, but that the fault's recurrence pattern indicated the machine's ultrafiltration control module had already been subjected to sustained pressure irregularity, and that the resulting stress on the module's internal components was the kind that standard service diagnostics did not capture. He called it cumulative operational fatigue. Out. He said the module would fail unpredictably and that on dialysis equipment unpredictable failure was a patient safety matter, not merely an operational one. He said FDA 21 CFR Part 820 required that any repair work on Class II medical devices be performed by a manufacturer-authorized technician, and that Warren Dill held no current Meridian authorization and had not held one since his separation from the company. Out. He said the work Warren had performed on that machine had technically compromised its certification status and that Meridian could not certify the remaining 11 units if a non-authorized party had already interacted with the first. Out. He said the combined certification value across all 12 machines was approximately $340,000 in covered service liability, and that he would strongly recommend Cascade Valley return all 12 units to Meridian's facility immediately before any further unauthorized interaction occurred. Out. Renata called Warren at 5:30 that evening and told him what she'd been told. Out. He asked for 48 hours. Out. She said she could give him until Thursday. Out. 30 minutes after that, a different call came in. It was from Meridian's legal contact at a Portland firm, advising Warren that his interaction with Cascade Valley's equipment may have constituted interference with an active service agreement, and that the company reserved its right to pursue remedies. Out. Warren thanked the attorney for the information and ended the call. Out. He sat at the workbench after Ben had gone to bed. Ben was 11. He had been 8 when Warren's wife Diane passed, and the 3 years since had not been the kind that assembled themselves into a clear narrative about how things were going. Out. They had been the kind that required constant quiet management, the daily arithmetic of a household running on one income that was not yet where it needed to be, 2 school years of after-school care that cost more than Warren had calculated, 1 alternator replacement on the truck that had pushed a month into the negative, and Ben's habit of asking questions Warren didn't have complete answers to about things Warren hadn't fully worked out himself. Out. He did not talk about this with Pete. He did not talk about it with anyone. Out. What he felt sitting at the workbench that night was not the ordinary version of frustrated. It was the specific quality of clarity that arrives when a person has watched something wrong stay wrong long enough to understand exactly what undoing it requires. Not anger, not urgency, something more deliberate than either. Out. He pulled the manila envelope out of the cabinet and set it on the bench. Out. The first document was the email he had sent Alan Fitch in November of 2022, his service bulletin, the Fresenius field advisory attached, the recommendation to add solenoid seat inspection to the PM checklist, the supporting data from both incident investigations. The second was Fitch's reply, not within current service protocol scope, proceed with standard PM procedures. Out. He photographed both, forwarded them to his personal email and saved copies in 3 locations. Out. Then he called a biomedical engineer named Dr. Sylvia Okafor at the University of Washington Medical Center, someone he had worked alongside during a regional Fresenius training program 4 years earlier. He explained the situation. Out. She asked him to send the documentation, read through it while he waited, and told him plainly that the solenoid seat failure mechanism he had described was consistent with known thermal behavior in this polymer grade under repeated clinical cycling, that his repair was technically sound, that the FDA regulation Meridian applied to manufacturer recalls and not to independent component-level service. Out. and that she would put that assessment in writing on institutional letterhead within the morning. Out. He thanked her and stayed on the phone a few minutes longer than the task required. Some conversations are just worth finishing. Out. Pete had spent the evening on his own time pulling hospital biomedical equipment complaint records from the FDA's MODE database. He found 9 documented F-77 incidents on 2022 Fresenius units at facilities across 5 states, 7 of them at hospitals with active Meridian service contracts. In all 9 cases, the documented resolution had been ultrafiltration module replacement. In none of them was there any record of solenoid seat inspection or replacement preceding the module work. Out. 9 incidents, 1 resolution every time. The same resolution that cost between $6,000 and $8,000 per machine. Out. Not the $9 fix. Out. By midnight, Warren had assembled everything into a sequence that could not be argued away by institutional authority, by legal language, or by the professional confidence of someone who expected not to be questioned. Out. Renata arranged the meeting, both parties in the same room, no intermediary managing the narrative for either side. Dennis Volk arrived with Meridian's regional compliance manager and a printed binder he placed at the center of the conference table. The binder had Meridian's logo on the cover and tabs along the edge, the kind of document that announces its own seriousness before anyone opens it. Out. Warren arrived with his laptop, a padded envelope, and the original solenoid seat in a small labeled bag, which he set on the table between them without explanation. Out. Volk presented first. The binder covered ultrafiltration module architecture, FDA device classification requirements, the legal language of Meridian's service agreement with Cascade Valley, the concept of cumulative operational fatigue in Class II medical equipment, and 2 citations from peer-reviewed biomedical engineering publications. He concluded that Warren's intervention had addressed a symptomatic indicator while leaving the actual underlying damage unresolved. Out. His compliance manager sat beside him in the way that compliance managers sit in these meetings, not speaking but present in a way that carried its own weight. Out. Warren waited for the room to go completely quiet before he moved. Out. He picked up the labeled bag, held it at the center of the table, looked at Dennis Volk and asked one question. Out. The machine he had repaired had run 12 full treatment simulations across 81 hours of logging since the solenoid seat was replaced. It had returned 0 fault codes at every interval, including repeated runs at full operating temperature. Was there anyone in this room willing to state in writing that the module in that machine had been damaged by his repair? Out. Volk looked at the bag, then at the table surface, then at the compliance manager beside him. Out. Nobody answered. Out. Warren opened his laptop and turned it to face the room. Out. He presented 4 things. Out. The temperature and pressure log from the original diagnostic, the F-77 fault presenting at 111 degrees, consistent across 3 separate runs, clearing immediately after solenoid seat replacement. Out. The post-repair simulation record, 81 hours, 12 sessions, 0 fault codes at every interval, including sustained high-temperature cycles. Out. The written assessment from Dr. Sylvia Okafor at UW Medical. The solenoid seat failure mechanism was thermally consistent, the repair was technically appropriate, and the FDA provision Meridian had cited did not apply to independent component-level service on non-recalled equipment. Out. The MODE database summary Pete had compiled, 9 documented F-77 incidents across 5 states, all on 2022 Fresenius units with Meridian service histories, all resolved by module replacement, none with any documented solenoid seat inspection preceding that resolution. Out. Volk allowed a pause before he spoke. Out. He said the field advisory Warren had referenced was a discretionary communication, not a mandatory service requirement. He said Meridian's technical team had reviewed its applicability and determined it fell outside the parameters of their standard PM protocol for accounts in the Pacific Northwest region. Out. He said it with the practiced composure of someone accustomed to making institutional conclusions sound like technical ones. Out. Warren opened the padded envelope and placed 2 pages on the table. Out. The first was his email to Alan Fitch dated November 14, 2022. Subject line: Fresenius 2022 solenoid seat failure pattern, urgent review recommended. The Fresenius field advisory was attached. The recommendation was explicit. Add solenoid seat inspection to PM checklist for all 2022 units in service portfolio. Out. The second was Fitch's reply, dated November 17, 2022. Not within current service protocol scope. Proceed with standard PM procedures. Out. The 2 pages lay flat under the conference room lights. No one spoke for close to 7 seconds. Out. Renata Cross was at the far end of the table with a legal pad she had not written on in the past 30 minutes. She looked at the 2 emails. Then she looked at Dennis Volk. Out. What crossed her face was not anger in the ordinary sense. It was the expression of someone doing a rapid and unwelcome recalculation, adjusting what they had assumed against something that did not accommodate the earlier version. Out. She had brought Meridian in 5 years ago. She had trusted the relationship in the way that institutions trust long vendor relationships, which is to say completely until a reason to do otherwise arrives and cannot be explained away. Out. 2 pages were providing the reason with a clarity she could not work around. Out. Volk's compliance manager raised the issue of confidentiality. Warren was no longer employed by Meridian. Internal correspondence was proprietary material. Out. Warren said he had printed both documents during his employment as the author of one of them and had maintained them in his own files. The compliance manager noted that Meridian reserved its rights. Out. The meeting ended without a formal resolution. Out. Renata walked the Meridian representatives to the elevator and returned to the conference room. She sat down across from Warren and looked at the 2 pages still on the table. Out. She asked how long he had worked at Meridian. Out. He said 6 years. Out. She asked why he had left. Out. He said he had been separated in January of 2024. The documentation cited performance below expectations for client retention metrics. Out. She looked at the table for a moment and didn't respond to that. Out. She said she would need 24 hours. Out. Warren drove back to the shop, picked Ben up from Pete's house and got home at 8:15. Ben ate cereal because it was what he wanted and Warren didn't have the energy to negotiate. They sat at the kitchen table, Ben working through a worksheet, Warren with his coffee, and neither of them said much. Ben asked once if everything was okay. Warren said it was getting there. Ben nodded and went back to his worksheet. Out. He was the kind of kid who took answers at face value when he sensed that pressing further wouldn't help. Out. Warren sat at the table after Ben went to bed and looked at the surface in front of him for a while. Out. He thought about the 9 facilities in the MOUD database. He thought about the patients in those dialysis chairs when the F7 fault tripped and the session was interrupted. He thought about the nurses who had absorbed those 40 minutes of extended procedure time, 12 machines across however many facilities, whatever that number added up to. He thought about the people who had written the checks for $7,250 a machine and received documentation that told them the module was the problem. Out. He wasn't certain whether Alan Fitch had made a business decision or a negligent one. He wasn't certain the distinction mattered at the point where the outcome was the same either way. Out. He went to bed at 11:15 and slept better than he expected to. Out. The call from Renata came at 9 the following morning. Out. She said she had spent the previous evening in the hospital's service records going back 3 years and had found something she felt Warren should know about before the situation moved to its next stage. Out. Meridian had submitted a preventive maintenance completion report to the hospital in November of this year. The report covering the 12 machines in question. Included in the report was a line item for ultrafiltration system inspection. The inspection was billed at $340 per unit. Across 12 machines, $4,080 in labor charges. The accompanying checklist showed each box checked, including one labeled solenoid assembly and manifold components. Out. The machines had developed F77 faults within 18 days of that inspection. Out. She said she had gone back to the prior year's PM report and found the same line item, the same check boxes, the same billing. Out. She said she then requested the technician logs from both visits. The logs showed time on site, machine serial numbers, and calibration readings. They did not show any record of manifold panel removal on any of the 12 units. The solenoid seat was located behind the front service panel. It was not accessible without removing that panel. Panel removal generated a torque log entry in the machine's internal service record. She had pulled all 12 service records. Out. Not one showed a torque entry for the front panel in either of the past 2 maintenance visits. Out. Meridian had billed for an inspection that had not been performed, twice. Out. Renata presented the documentation to the hospital's board that afternoon. The procurement records, the service logs, the torque records, the modded data Pete had compiled, the solenoid seat failure mechanism as explained in writing by Dr. Okafor, and the 2 emails, Warren's submission to Alan Fitch and Fitch's reply, laid out in the order they had occurred. Out. She did not editorialize. She set the documents in sequence and let the chronology carry the weight. Out. The board suspended Cascade Valley's service agreement with Meridian pending investigation and referred the billing irregularities to the hospital's Legal and Compliance Council by unanimous vote before 5 o'clock. Out. Meridian's account director was notified by email. Out. Warren was in the shop finishing paperwork on a ventilator service when his phone showed a call from a number he didn't recognize with a 206 area code. He almost let it go to voicemail. Out. It was Paula Fitch, not Alan. Paula was Alan's wife, and she was calling because Alan had asked her to. She said her husband wanted Warren to know that what had happened in 2022 was not what Alan had intended it to be. She said Alan had been under pressure from the company's sales leadership to protect module replacement revenue, and that he had not known at the time how far the consequence of the service protocol decision would go. She said Alan was not a bad man. She said he was sorry. Warren thanked her for calling. He said he believed her. He sat with the call for a while after it ended. He did not know what to do with it exactly. It was not resolution. It was not apology in any form that changed the past 14 months or restored anything that had been removed. But it was something, the kind of something that costs a person to offer and means more for that cost, even if it doesn't settle much. Renata called that evening at 6:15. She said she owed him a direct acknowledgement of 3 things. First, she had allowed Meridian's legal framing to put her in a position of considering a course of action against him that the documentation had not supported, and that was not something she felt good about. Second, she had run a vendor relationship on the assumption that longevity was equivalent to integrity, which was a management failure she intended to correct. Third, she understood that what had happened to him at Meridian in January of 2024 was connected to the decision his supervisor had made in November of 2022, and that she couldn't change that, but she wanted him to know she understood it clearly. Warren said he appreciated her saying so. The line held open for a moment. He didn't fill it. She didn't fill it. Sometimes the right thing to say to 3 honest sentences is nothing at all. Meridian repaired all 12 machines at their own expense in the following 10 days. Each received a solenoid seat inspection and replacement, documented with panel torque logs and post-repair simulation records. No modules were replaced in any of the 12 units. The combined parts cost across the fleet was $108. Cascade Valley was charged nothing. The repairs were completed under a written settlement agreement that acknowledged the billing irregularity and released the hospital from any outstanding contract obligations. Renata accepted the keys on a Wednesday morning without ceremony. The regulatory referral that followed involved the Washington State Department of Health's Medical Device Oversight Division and Fresenius's own service compliance team. The review extended across 19 months of Meridian service records in the Pacific Northwest region and identified 31 instances of module-level replacements billed at full price on 2022 Fresenius units where solenoid seat inspection had either not been performed or not been documented. The findings were shared with the FDA's Device Reporting Office and with the Attorney's General offices in 3 states. The restitution process that followed cost Meridian considerably more than the original $87,000 estimate that had set the entire sequence in motion. 2 weeks after the case closed, Renata Cross called Warren and offered Dill Biomedical Services the Cascade Valley preventive maintenance contract for biomedical equipment across both campuses. The contract covered 47 units and included a renewal option at the end of 18 months. The value of the agreement was enough to bring Pete on full-time before December and add a second technician by spring. Pete signed the offer letter on the same afternoon Warren signed the contract. Neither of them said much about the moment beyond the paperwork. The shop changed in the weeks that followed the way that shops change when the margin finally clears, not dramatically but in the specific ways that had been deferred. A new calibration station took its place against the back wall. The front office got a proper coffee machine. Pete repainted the exterior sign on a Saturday when the weather held. On a Thursday evening in late November, the sky over Clement Street was pale and flat, the particular kind of late autumn stillness that settles after a stretch of weeks that asked more than usual. Warren was at the bench finishing a service log when Ben came in through the side door with his backpack on one shoulder and a piece of paper folded into thirds that he set on the corner of the bench before going to the front office to do his homework. Warren unfolded it under the bench light. It was a drawing done in colored pencil, a building with a sign above the door, careful approximate letters spelling out the name of the shop. 2 figures inside, one tall, one not, a truck parked in front, a small dog that did not belong to either of them, which Ben had added anyway for reasons of his own. Warren folded it along its original creases and set it on the shelf above his workbench. Then he picked up his pen and went back to the service log in front of him. The line item on the first completed Cascade Valley invoice read $9 for parts and 2 hours at his standard labor rate. He signed it and filed it with the rest. There are people who are removed from institutions because they ask questions the institution has determined it cannot afford to have answered. And there are the answers to those questions sitting in manifold housings, in solenoid seats, in the service logs of machines that should have been checked and weren't. waiting with the uncomplicated patience of things that are simply true, regardless of whether anyone with the authority to act on them chooses to look. The estimate had said $87,000 out. The repair had cost $9, and the willingness to say so out loud in a room where saying so was not comfortable. The distance between those two numbers was not an error. It was a calculation someone had made, counting on the certainty that most people would not ask a second time. The trouble with that kind of certainty is that it holds only until the person who will ask comes along, and that person almost never announces themselves in advance. Out. I keep thinking about that shelf above Warren's workbench, the service log, the drawing Ben made in colored pencil, the way Warren folded it along its original creases without making anything of the moment. That image stays with me longer than any part of what came before it, because it tells you everything about the kind of person Warren Dill actually is, and why what happened to him was always going to catch up with the people who thought they had made it disappear. Out. There's a version of this story where Warren stays quiet, where the manila envelope stays in the filing cabinet, where he takes the settlement offer, absorbs the legal threat, and protects himself the way people with mortgages and 11-year-olds, and not quite enough margin tend to protect themselves. Most people would have made that choice, and no one would have blamed them for it. Out. But Warren had something that the people across the table from him had calculated he didn't, not luck, not connections, not leverage in any conventional sense. He had the kind of integrity that doesn't perform itself. The kind that just sits there, in a labeled parts tray, in a calibration log, in an email dated November 14, 2022, waiting. When the moment came, he didn't need to raise his voice. He put 2 pages on the table and let the record speak. Out. That's what I think about when people ask whether honesty is worth the cost. Warren lost a career for filing an accurate report. He spent 14 months rebuilding something smaller than what he had, on thinner margins in a converted garage, while raising a son alone. The honest answer is that the cost was real and no one gave it back to him. Out. What I believe, not from faith in any system but from watching what actually happened, is that a person who carries that kind of record with them eventually stands in a room where it matters, and when that moment comes, there is nothing the other side can say. Out. What Alan Fitch and Dennis Volk had built required people to not look closely. Warren's entire career had been built on looking closely. That's not a coincidence. That's the specific shape of how those two things were always going to meet. Out. There's something else that stayed with me. Pete Vargas spending his own evening pulling Maudi database records because he wanted to. Dr. Sylvia Okafor reading a stranger's documentation and putting her assessment in writing the same night. The people who showed up for Warren weren't repaying a debt. They showed up because the work was right and the cause was clear. Out. That's what genuine credibility builds over time. Not followers, not favors, but people who recognize honesty when they see it and trust it enough to stand beside it. Out. Ben asked his father once if everything was okay. Warren said it was getting there. It was the truest answer he could give, and Ben accepted it because he understood, in the way children do, that his father wasn't someone who said things he didn't mean. Out. I think about that exchange more than I expected to. The work of raising a child alone, of keeping the lights on, of never cutting corners even when cutting corners would have cost nothing visible, all of it accumulates into something, not a dramatic moment, a shelf, a folded drawing, a $9 part that held at operating temperature every single time. Out. The estimate said $87,000. The truth cost $9 and the willingness to say it out loud. Out. That distance doesn't close by accident. It closes because someone decided a long time before the meeting that they were not going to be the kind of person who looked the other way.